lot of young people in the audience. So I said, I'm going to do something to really wow them on a virtuosic level, and something they could relate to. So I used the double pedals. So it's something that Louis Bellson developed first, but their reference point, oh, they see rock drummers doing that and heavy metal bands. So I took that direction, and you know.
I want to talk to you a little bit again about the Latin descarga. So we go back to the Palladium Ballroom, and the descarga is the go-off. This is what they were doing at the Palladium, the go-offs, right? And so somebody would say, well, that's not a definition that you find on Wikipedia or anywhere. Well, let's speak to that. So we have the big three. We have Machito and his Afro-Cubans, we have Tito Rodriguez, and we have Tito Puente.
All of these anthems have one thing in common: the very heavy presence of Latin percussive instruments.
Everyone was there. It's amazing because, you know, I have a lot of Latin in my music. It's amazing, I mean, because I had been playing New York clubs and building a reputation just playing dances and bar mitzvahs and weddings. And then I got into the clubs like the Cheetah, Trudy Heller's, Big Wilt Small's Paradise, the Club Baron. I became the king of the dances, Tito Puente and myself. We started, so being around a lot of Latin, Joe Cuba, Tito Puente, Ricardo Rey, those are my favorites, I could hear that. And, you know, I'm from Bermuda, basically, my family anyway, so you have that Latin thing within you. And Johnny Pacheco was making great cowbells at the time, so I learned authentic music through Tito Puente and those guys. Hala Hala, Ibugalu, you know, get down, get down.
Whose idea was it to have that massive break, that world-famous break in the song?
Peace will come, the world west?
The drum solo, the drum break.
Oh, the breakdown.
Yeah.
Mine. Of course, you got to have the Latin. I had to go to the timbales. The only way you can do it is for to break it down so I can get to the timbales.
Who played the timbales on the track?
Me.
You did all the drum work.
Yeah.
Incredible. Yeah, I could definitely hear the Tito influence on that.
Oh yeah.
That was a lie. You know, again, you're turned into the Lion Kings, you know, and then they're not them cats just on Broadway.
Wow. And when Barry Rogers told me, Eddie, after the night before you go home, I want you to hear something on a Sunday.
Right.
And it was the John Coltrane. And then when he sat down to maybe figure out the payroll or write lyrics to when he did about
I Love Supreme.
I Love Supreme, yeah. Maybe he's writing lyrics for that, I don't know. He leaves McCoy Tyner taking a solo, Bobby. And that solo went for about between 15 to 20 minutes or more.
Wow.
After inception. With the bebop revolution of the 1940s, improvisation became arguably the defining element of jazz. Jazz improvisation began with a process of embellishment or stylized interpretation of the melody. In ensemble jazz, this took the form of group improvisation, where each instrumentalist exercised a moderate amount of freedom in fulfilling a prescribed melodic or harmonic role. Although occasional breaks and short solos existed in early jazz, the fully developed jazz solo did not appear until Louis Armstrong's work of the mid-1920s. The extended solo provided a useful formula for jazz performance, Successive solos over repeated choruses or sections of the tune allowed suitable length for dancing without all musicians having to play continuously. In the larger ensembles of the swing era, intricate arrangements take the place of continuously repeated solos, as improvisation is reduced to a lesser but still significant role. With the advent of bebop, however, improvisation clearly emerges as the central component of the music. The harmonic structure of the tune assumes more importance than the melody. Whereas many swing musicians had been accustomed to faking solos by ear, the demanding tempos and chord sequences of bebop made it necessary for musicians to learn thoroughly the chords to the tunes they improvised on. This was a major paradigm shift, and it has held sway in most jazz since that time. Jazz musicians before Charlie Parker had the option of simply reinterpreting the melody and making it hot. Jazz musicians after Charlie Parker were expected to create something new and original from the harmonic structure of the tune.
The real power of jazz and the innovation of jazz is that a group of people can come together and create art, improvised art, and can negotiate their agendas with each other. And that negotiation is the art. Like you'll hear all the time when Bach improvised, and he did improvise, but he wasn't going to look at the second viola and say, okay, let's play Ein Feisty Berg. They were not going to do that. Whereas in jazz, I could get together, I could go to Milwaukee tomorrow, and it'd be 3 musicians. I walk in a bar at 2:30 in the morning and say, what you want to play, man? Let's play some blues. Well, all 4 of us are going to start playing. And I might say, do-do-do-lee-do, and they'll say, bo-bo-do-do-do-lee-do, everybody will just start comping and playing and listening, and the bass, you never know what they're going to do. So that's our art. The 4 of us can now have a dialogue. We can have a conversation. We can speak to each other in the language of music.
Thus, by the beginning of the 20th century, improvisation had all but disappeared from the European tradition of art music, and from the light, popular music derived from it, Victorian parlor ballads, music hall songs, brass and military band music, and so on. Already, however, quite different traditions of improvisation had been established in the West as a result of the modern African diaspora. In Latin America and in the Caribbean islands, the mixture of African and European elements led to a variety of new musical styles, but it was above all the gradual emergence of distinctive African-American genres in the United States between the Civil War and the turn of the century that restored the improvising performer to a position of prominence, and that was ultimately to have an enormous influence on a variety of popular music styles in the 20th century and beyond. More specifically, it was the achievement of jazz musicians to restore improvisation to a central position in Western musical culture by creating a tradition that had the improvised solo, rather than the written score, at its heart. Early improvised solos often consisted of simple syncopated phrases and basic arpeggios. However, more than any other individual, Armstrong revealed the musical and aesthetic possibilities of jazz improvisation. His formidable technique and range were matched by bold melodic imagination and superb rhythmic poise. His urgent, hot solos were unprecedented and, through recordings, enormously influential. Armstrong's work not only acted as a catalyst for the development of other jazz players, notably tenor saxophonist Coleman Hawkins, 1904-69, but also placed the improvised solo in the mainstream of mass culture through his own career as an entertainer, and through his direct influence on the instrumental stars of the swing-era big bands. Trumpeters Roy Eldridge, Harry James, and Buddy Berrigan, for example, all based their work on Armstrong.
Dimensions in Music, From Mambo to Salsa, Part 6, The Rhythm Sticks by Alan Lockwood. Afro-Cuban music's polyrhythmic structures evolved from ceremonial African hand drum ensembles, rumba, like Puerto Rican bamba, fused hand drummers, singers, and dancers, while in a 1930s innovation on Havana's band scene, Arsenio Rodriguez beefed up bongo-driven son with the conga's deeper resonance. Mambo projected timekeeping into 1940s dance halls using the timbales paired toms, and drum sets came into play as orchestras swung towards jazz, galvanized when conguero Chano Pozo joined Dizzy Gillespie's big band. Timbales and drum sets are played with sticks, though as René Lopez, who produced Smithsonian and Rockefeller recordings and influential 1970s discs by Grupo Folclórico y Experimental Neoyorquino pointed out in an interview, the timbales are a traditional charanga instrument played with sticks and hands. The downbeat is hit on the deep drum, reinforcing the tumbeo of the conguero. Lopez noted that Cuba's two dominant 50s drummers played both instruments. Timbalero Guillermo Barreto doubled on drum set, while Blas Eags was the on-call trap drummer for the formidable Orquesta Riverside.
I have most of the original CDs, but some may be hard to come.
Once Tito Puente established his orchestra, the third element, the timbal, was used as a simple instrument to join the isolated section of the tumba and the bongo to the rest of the band. The purely Cuban timbal, which used to be relied on more extensively for performing the danzón, became merely an addition to the conventional drum kit in this new, Americanized musical expression. In Mexico, Pérez Prado had assigned one musician to move seamlessly from the timbal to the drum set, while the conga player also was responsible for keeping the beat. Even in Cuba, when jam sessions integrated the improvisational elements of jazz, musicians such as Guillermo Barreto began to use the timbales AC chording to U.S. jazz methods rather than those of the Cuban danzón. Yet it was in New York, where the jazz band acquired its true configuration, that the timbal was definitively modified. This was the direct result of Puente's pioneering work, which made him known throughout the entire Caribbean and, undoubtedly, the most influential of all timbaleros for decades to come.
With those descargas of Cachao, he did it in a special way, and it was the pinnacle. At that time in '57, when that happened, it was the pinnacle of this idea of the percussionists as virtuosos. Those gentlemen I mentioned, Barretico, Tatawines, they were Picassos on their instruments. They didn't just hold time. They had great sense of time, great sound on their instruments.
The 1957 recording, Cuban Jam Sessions, also called Descargas, featuring bassist Israel Cachao Lopez, master Conguero Tata Guines and timbalero Guillermo Barreto, had a strong influence on New York's Latin musicians in the 60s. The term descargas, discharge, or unload, here meant jam sessions where musicians and vocalists unloaded their ideas, stretched out, and developed longer solos utilizing jazz techniques in the Latin format. Cuban drummers and percussionists have always been heavily influenced by American drummers from the jazz and pop fields. Cuban drummer, Guillermo Barreto, was well versed in jazz. Says Ignacio Barrera, he was one of the most incredible drummers that ever lived. When I was a kid, Tommy Dorsey went to play at the Tropicana with Buddy Rich on drums. One night Buddy got sick and Barreto played the show. Of course he didn't have the same chops, but he played the show well. When Dizzy Gillespie went to Cuba, Guillermo knew every tune that Dizzy had recorded. The influence of the American big bands can also be seen in the orchestras of Benny Moré and Arturo Chico O'Farrell, with the addition of a full brass section, saxophones, plus bass drum and cymbal to the timbale setup.
Desde el pasado siglo se asentaron familias de músicos relevantes como las orquestas femeninas Doña Irene y Edén Habanero, Bebo Valdés y su hijo Chucho Valdés, los hermanos Barreto Brown, Guillermo baterista, Roberto Robi clarinetista, Alejandro Coco sobresaliente trompeta, los bailadores del club de jazz. La autenticidad de Santa Amalia es historia en la música cubana.
Mi madre no era cubana, había nacido en Jamaica. Vino a Cuba, era como una iglesia, un church. cuando vinieron ellos aquí a Tropical. Después de Guillermo vino Josefina Barreto, es la más chica de todos nosotros, los Barretos Brown. Empezó a tocar cuando tenía 9 años, ya. Podía tocar acompañar a un grupo de orquesta. Aprendió piano también, pero su instrumento era la batería.
Mi instrumento donde heredé de esa gran gloria de Cuba, mi tío Guillermo Barreto, fue mi profesor donde me había enseñado la batería y no tenía el concepto del timbal. Este es un instrumento que para mí es un patrimonio. Él lo adquirió creo que en los años 50. En él hizo todas sus incursiones en la música, en Tropicana, con los amigos.
Desde pequeños fuimos inseparables. Formábamos un trío allá en Santa Amalia, donde yo bailaba swing, él tocaba batería y mi hermano Robbie tocaba el clarinete. Desde pequeñín ya él tenía unas condiciones musicales tremendas. En Santa Amalia nosotros, desde pequeño yo me acuerdo, era un centro de muchos músicos que llegaban allí a la casa para celebrar descargas o celebrar en esa época como se llamaban jam session. Y Guillermo tenía ese sentido de la reproducción musical que se desarrolló desde temprana edad. Ya después cuando crece forma parte de la orquesta.
Percussionist Eddie Bobe, who led Central Park's rumba circle for 2 decades, said, "The timbal is a Cuban Creole instrument, evolved from the timpani used in danzón and other music of the period." Some say the name derived from the drum's contrasting sounds, high, tim, and low, ball. The rumba elements are camouflaged within dance band settings, in cowbell ride patterns and when the drum shells are struck, a technique called the casquera, while bongos reflect the quinto, rumba's highest sounding, improvising drum. By the 70s, when salsa began, probably the important timbalero was Nicky Marrero, Bobe said. The timbalero's role is to play time, patterns on bell or cymbal, accent horn lines, and solo. Nicky did this all on his own, and his ingenuity is very high grade. He was influenced by Tito Puente and Willie Bobo. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and New York have distinct ways of interpreting the timbal's shapes, drum patterns, and tuning. Caribbean drums are based on melody, something that's inherent in Latin percussion traditions. New York timbaleros were doubling on bongo, but Bobe noted that, when the drum set came into prominence in Cuba in the 70s, the bongo became obsolete there. Shanguito was one of the songo rhythms creators with Los Van Van. Ignacio Baroa brought songo here and taught it to Steve Barrios, whose studies with Jolito Colazo, the master drummer who brought Havana folklore to mid-50s New York, make him unique. Steve plays bata drums and conga, retaining African feel and phrasing.
Hi everybody, Bobby Sanabria here for this edition of Percussion Discussion. I guess you know what this instrument is. The timbales. And you've probably seen Maestro Tito Puente, the king of the timbales, play this instrument. Actually, Maestro Puente revolutionized the way this instrument is played. But let me give you a little bit of the history, the basics of the instrument, how to play it, especially in this context, what we call the danzón, the first style that you must learn to be able to be a proficient timbalero if you're a guy, or timbalera if you're a girl. First of all, let's talk about the instrument itself. Well, what was it invented for? It was invented for a style of Cuban music known as danzón, meaning grand or great dance. And that style of music was developed by a great Cuban musician by the name of Miguel Failde, who came from Matanzas, Cuba, the city across the bay from La Habana. Miguel was what we call a mulatto. He was part of African heritage and part of European heritage. And he studied many different instruments. He was proficient on brass instruments, also on the piano and on the violin. So what he did was, in 1877, he fused the French contradance, this European dance tradition that actually were country dances by the farmers that were adapted by the bourgeoisie in France, Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, other places, the high courts, and they adapted it to their own means. That music was brought to Haiti during the colonial period. It got to Cuba, it got to Puerto Rico, it got to New Orleans, Louisiana. And in Cuba, it inspired Miguel Failde to create what he called the grand dance, or danzón. Now, the first band that he formed in 1879 to play his first danzón, which he composed, Las Alturas de Simpson, in 1877. Wow, it took him 2 years to form a band to finally perform his first piece. It was made up of brass instruments, clarinet, some strings, concert tuba known as a bombardino or euphonium, piano, bass, and believe it or not, European style kettle drums, the timpani, yeah, and it was a big hit. The press lauded this as the new national music of Cuba. And you're probably wondering, well, why that? Because obviously the song tradition existed, but people knew that in Eastern Cuba, the song, the root of what we call salsa, that tradition didn't come until the late 19th century to La Habana. And that tradition, the song, and all the subgenres in it, like the guajira, the guaracha, etc., well, they were all done in an impromptu, improvisational kind of way. Nobody really wrote them down. They were folk song traditions. But now with the danzón, since Miguel Failde was classically trained, he wrote everything down, very meticulous in the arranging, etc., etc. It became a big hit, and he got to travel for the next 20 years from 1879 onward to Veracruz, Mexico. He was invited to perform there, and there the music took hold in its original form, in what the style of band that became known as a danzonera. These large ensembles that would play outdoors in the town square. Believe it or not, that music, the danzón, as it was played by these danzoneras, is still played that way in Veracruz, Mexico. It's like taking a time machine back into the 19th century. Farida, as I said before, went there, concertized there for the next 20 years. And you can go to Veracruz and you can hear actual danzoneras at a place called Salón Mexico that actually play the danzón in that original style. It's a beautiful dance, it's a box step, etc., etc. And there are many elements to it. Then finally, in 1899, a pianist by the name of Antonio Maria Romeo decides to bring the danzón, adapt it and scale it down in terms of instrumentation into a small group that he called a charanga francesa, or a charanga, C-H-A-R-A-N-G-A. And to do that, he eliminates the brass. He replaces that with a wooden Baroque flute known as a tercerola. It's a 5-key French-style flute from the Baroque period. Very high piercing, etc. Uses violins, uses the acoustic bass, as I said before, and he uses the piano, but he replaces the timpani, the European timpani, with what became known as the timbales, which is the French word for the kettle drums or the timpanis. So you got to be careful when you go to Europe, and if you see a symphony orchestra and you look at the score and it says timbales, a French composer wrote it, they're not talking about the Cuban timbales, they're talking about the European kettle drums. But that inspired the use of this, the timbales. Now, before the timbales came a smaller set based on the European kettle drums, the European timpani, known as timbal criollo. It's like a smaller version of the European timpani. But what's interesting about it is they were played in an Africanized way, like I was doing before. And you do on the instrument, whether you're playing the timbal criollo, the timpani, or the timbales in the Cuban form, what we call baqueteo, B-A-Q-U-E-T-E-O. Now, this is highly arranged music. Another instrument that's used in the danzón, whether it's played by a danzonera or the charanga, is this, the guiro. Now, how did this danzón, the way they played it back in the 19th century, sound in the context of a danzonera orchestra, which is a combination of strings and brass, also saxophones, clarinet, etc. And the use of the way they used to play the European timpani, but not with a mallet like this, but with sticks like this, with no beads or heads on them, okay? And even fatter. Well, you're in for a treat. Let's look at the great Acerina, another transplanted Cuban who moved to Mexico and formed his own danzonera orchestra, Acerina y su danzonera. And let's watch him play with his orchestra in the early style of the way the danzón was played. Now, pay attention to the person that plays this instrument, the guiro. He is in sync totally with what Acerina is playing, and you'll hear somebody playing the clave, the beat that you first heard me play before, with my foot. Let's look at Acerina y su danzonera, playing the danzón the way it was originally played on the timpani. Now, remember, when you watch Acerina, he's left-handed. So everything that I did for you before, it's reversed. But check out also how he plays the side of the shell of the timbales, which is known as cáscara, C-A-S-C-A-R-A. It's also known as paila, P-A-I-L-A, and it's also the Spanish word for this instrument. So if you, I'm a young musician, and somebody, salsa orchestra gives you an arrangement, the timbale part, and it says on the top, paila, it basically means the timbales, but it also means you're going to be playing the side of the shell. If it's cáscara, it means you're going to be playing the side of the shell. The instrument of itself, I'm going to do it a little bit faster, is because in the 1920s, in the mid-1920s, a gentleman by the name of Aniceto Diaz, another great Cuban composer, started writing danzons with lyrics to them, okay? And at a faster tempo. This became known as the danzonete, okay? So up until then, the danzones were all instrumental, all completely written out, right? And no improvisation was happening at all right? Every once in a while, Antonio Maria Romeo, the pianist, during his compositions, he would do what we call a little filigree on the piano. He was the pianist. Very important person to know. He's responsible for over 2,000 compositions. And he's part of the history of la música cubana. Okay? But no improvisation. Occasionally, the timbalero, or timbalera if it's a female, would do repiques, little fills, that we'll get into later on. But let me give you an example of a tempo for Aniceto Diaz's original composition, Danzonete, and I'll sing a little bit of it. It's in 2/3 clave. I'll be going to do the same baqueteo, but it's at a faster tempo. So I'm going to do the clave first so you hear where it is, and you can clap along or tap along. If you have a set of claves or sticks, you can tap the clave out with that. It's in 2/3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Danzonete. So that's a little bit of a fragment of Aniceto Diaz's Danzonete. Then discussion when we get into part 2 of the basics of the danzón, and we're going to get into the cha-cha-cha and also how to play the bolero. But let me conclude by giving you 2 examples of repiques, fills that a timbale player would do in an improvisational context. When we're talking about the repiques, they're not solos, it's talking. Remember, we inherited all of this rhythmic vocabulary and redefined it into the music that we do today in various ways. And the main thing that we inherited is being able to speak, hablar en el tambor, no matter what context it is, whether it's the danzón from Cuba, whether it's the bombasica from Puerto Rico, whether it's the merengue from the Dominican Republic, etc., just to give you 3 examples of African rhythmic-based music that we do in the diaspora. Okay? So, the first repique I'm going to do for you is on the 2 sides of the clave. Okay? A basic repique on the 2 sides. Listen to how it sounds. I'm going to use the rim of the drum, and to get the sound, I hit between the last 1/3 of the stick to here. Okay? Clave wise, it'll sound like this in 2/3. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. 2, 3, 4, 1. 2, 3, 4, 1. Let's hear how it sounds in context with the baqueteo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we go. Slow. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we go. didn't play anything there, so you can hear the 3 side of the clave all by itself. Now, the next one is on the 3 side of the clave. Okay? Here's what it sounds like in context. Starting in 3, starting in 2, 3. 1, 2, 1, 2. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. I did a little roll there, un redoble, okay? The roll in drumming terms, if we use the vocabulary of the snare drum, is a 5-stroke roll. Slow. Okay. Right, left, right. And then fast, 1, 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. If you've never done rolls at all ever, one thing you can do is take a pillow, take your sticks, and just practice this. Right, right, left, left. Right, right, left, left. Mama, daddy, mama. Let's do that. You can do that watching The Twilight Zone, Family Guy, whatever. Just keep doing that, so that you develop the technique of doing what we call doubles, 2 in each hand. All right? So, let's hear this in context. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. One time I did it with one hand. You can do it that way as well. Okay, now let's do it together with the relleno, or sorry, repique, the filling in of the 2 side. Really slow. And what happens when you put them both together? You have una conversación, a conversation. The drum is talking. Okay? And 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we go. Again, back to the basic rhythm of the baqueteo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that time, I added that 5-stroke roll, those 5 strokes, as another fill-in in there to adorn, ornament, okay? And this is what we do as timbaleros in this style of music. It's a very beautiful style. It's the first style that you must learn on the timbales to be a well-versed timbalero.
Berrios, having fused big stints with Mongo Santamaria and Art Blakey into a drumming technique both ravishing and daunting, joined with Jerry and Andy Gonzalez in the Fort Apache Band in 1980. Of drums and timbals since the 1930s, Berrios said, there were society gigs and you played a tango, a paso doble, then a foxtrot, you always had timbals and a drum set, according to the song. Tito Puente put timbals in the front, because he was percussionist and bandleader. You couldn't call Tito's solo-style Cuban, it was definitely a New York style, and he applied trap set techniques. My big band influences were Sonny Payne with Basie and Charlie Persip with Gillespie. I saw them a lot when my parents took me to the Apollo. Julito Colazo was my big Afro-Cuban influence. Religious drummers usually only do that, ceremonial hand drumming, but Julito liked Count Basie, and recorded on trap drums with Tito Puente, and with Palmieri on timbals and bongo. What he brought to the table was really amazing. Berrios's First World from 1995 featured jazz luminaries and rumberos Colazo and Eddie Bobe. Fort Apache's wide-ranging skills, Berrios noted, will go from a rumba typical Afro-Cuban feeling to hard bop.
The king of swing in the 1930s wasn't Benny Goodman or Count Basie, it was Chick Webb. the drummer fielded, managed, and drove one of the best dance bands in the country and held court at New York's Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. Webb's band was built to keep people dancing, and the swing he produced to do so was imitated while he was at the peak of his fame and for years after his death. What does it mean to be called King of the Savoy when you stand barely 5 feet tall, your back twisted by childhood disease, and every performance leaves you gasping in pain? For William Henry Chick Webb, the answer was found in the thunderous roll of the drums and the electrifying energy he brought to the Harlem dance floors. I can't understand the pain God gave me. I can't understand my sickness, but that's secondary. The main thing is, the Lord gave me the talent to play drums. He gave me some years to play. That's what I wanted to do, Webb once reflected, capturing the indomitable spirit that propelled him from the streets of Baltimore to the pinnacle of the swing era. Along with the likes of Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, and Cab Calloway, Webb helped create the popular dance and music culture, known as swing, that swept the United States during and after the Great Depression and left an indelible impact on American culture. Born with fragile limbs, by age 11 he was already performing professionally, and by 17 he had moved to New York City, determined to carve out a place in the city's vibrant jazz scene. As the leader of one of the most formidable big bands of the 1930s, Webb's orchestra became the house band at Harlem's legendary Savoy Ballroom, setting the standard for swing with a blend of precision, power, and infectious rhythm. His band regularly triumphed in Battle of the Bands, showdowns against giants like Benny Goodman and Count Basie, earning Webb a reputation as the drummer who could not be bested, even by the era's most celebrated musicians. Drummer and bandleader Chick Webb is barely remembered today. If he is known at all, it's likely because he's the man who discovered Ella Fitzgerald. But Webb's contributions to jazz and American music go way beyond that. He was one of the most influential drummers who ever lived, having influenced everyone from Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich to Kenny Clarke and Art Blakey, and can be credited in good measure as being the architect of big band drumming. Was Webb the first modern jazz drummer? That's the verdict of jazz drum masters, including Joe Jones, Art Blakey, Kenny Clarke, and Max Roach. At the Savoy, Webb's band bested most of his competitors in the famed Battle of the Bands competitions, including those led by Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, and Count Basie. The battle between Webb's orchestra against Goodman's orchestra, dubbed the Music Battle of the Century, has become the story of legend. In the article, The Legendary Chick Webb by Robert Hillary, the writer recounts this event. A massive crowd packed the Savoy Ballroom, with thousands more turned away outside on the evening of May 11th, 1937, as Chick Webb and the Benny Goodman Band fought it out in a legendary Battle of the Bands. Police lined the bandstand as the Goodman Band stormed on, and aptly propelled by Gene Krupa, reached a peak level of performance. Though one might have thought it impossible to outplay the Goodman Band of 1937, Chick Webb proved otherwise that evening as his band came on, supercharged, blasting out one exciting arrangement after another. The huge crowd reached a frenzy level as the little dynamo put his band through its paces, driving them to unexcelled heights and practically blowing the roof right off the old Savoy. In the end, Goodman drummer Gene Krupa proclaimed, "I was never beat by a better man." The fact that he did any of this is something of a miracle. As a result of a fall he suffered as an infant, he crushed several vertebrae that required surgery. This eventually progressed to tuberculosis of the spine and a badly deformed spine, which not only stunted his growth, but caused him to appear hunchbacked. It wasn't until momentum. Chick Webb simultaneously defined drumming during the swing era, while also paving the way for the modern jazz movement of the 1940s. His amazing technique, syncopated phrasing, and dazzling showmanship made him the idol of many drumming greats, including Gene Krupa, Buddy Rich, Art Blakey, and Max Roach. Webb expanded the scope of what was possible for drummers in music, in the music business, and in the culture.
Art Blakey and Duke Ellington both acknowledged Webb's influence on their work. Gene Krupa credited Webb for increasing drummer awareness and laying the path for drummer-led bands such as his own. Webb's booming solos added complexity and fire, paving the way for Buddy Rich and Louis Bellson. Now, jazz drummer Tommy Benford claims he taught him how to play drums. After relocating to New York in 1925, he led bands in numerous clubs until settling in for extended regular performances at the Savoy Ballroom beginning in 1931. He rose to prominence as a band leader and drummer in the emerging swing movement. Drummer Buddy Rich credited Webb's powerful technique and brilliant performances with substantially influencing his own drumming, even referring to him as the daddy of them all. Webb couldn't.
After moving to New York in 1925, he spent the following 6 years leading bands in clubs. He achieved his greatest celebrity at the enormous Savoy, the world's most famous ballroom. The highlights of the Savoy era were the regular contests between the greatest bands of the day. The Webb musicians had become the unofficial house band, and they served as reigning champions. They alternated with the competing bands, each playing similar sets with abandon as the crowd danced and finally indicated its choice of winner. On only one occasion was Webb's band vanquished, losing to the great Duke Ellington on March 7, 1937. On May 11, 1937, in one of the most famous competitions, Webb defeated Benny Goodman and his band, then at the height of their popularity, with Gene Krupa on drums. Of Webb, Krupa was to say, "Chick taught me more than anyone." He worked those cymbals with great facility and freedom and taste. The sound he got from his drums was marvelous. His playing, so clean and fast and technical, had the kind of drive that is impossible to describe if you weren't there to feel it. The records don't do him justice. Chick was the guy who made big band playing an art, a great craft.
He was playing very inventive, and I loved the feeling of what he was doing. And I'll never forget that. That's one of the things that really grabbed me, because he sounded very different than any of the drummers that I had heard before.
Whenever I think of Chick, I always smile.
Clearly, Puente learned what he thought was important and made it part of his music. He successfully balanced the academy and the street to enjoy an extremely successful performance and recording career. In addition, Puente saw the value in completing an education and would later set up a scholarship fund to help young musicians complete their degrees. Loza's in-depth study of Tito Puente's life and music includes the assessment by Bobby Sanabria that Puente was among the first to incorporate jazz big band breaks into his Latin drumming. Tito made his early recordings with José Curbelo and Machito, and Tito Rodriguez, proving to be one of the first drummers in Latin music to use a combination of timbales, bass drum and cymbal to kick big band figures, often without bongo or conga accompaniment. Tito's concept of chart interpretation and kicking of figures was most likely influenced by Mario Bauza, Machito's musical director. Bauza had previously served as musical director for Chick Webb, whom jazz historians generally acknowledge as the first drummer to kick figures in a big band context.
Recordings. We began with Clap Hands, Here Comes Charlie. Then we heard of the Little Chicks, one of the small groups.
Yeah.
Small group out of the band, Wayman Carver on the flute, Chauncey Horton on the clarinet and the rhythm section, and a little Spanish Town, and then we heard the big band with the famous Liza, Benny Carter arrangement, late 1930s. Well, he died in 1939, so it must have been about 37 or 38. Unfortunately, I don't have the recording date right in front of me.
Well, see, now this shows what Chick Webb was all about. We heard, I mean, at this time, what was happening was here's a man who brought drumming to the forefront. You know, I mean, not just the fact that he was the leader of the band. You know, because being the leader of the band doesn't mean you necessarily have to be the loudest person in the band and so on and be so forthright with. So what he did is he brought what is probably the beginning of what you would call solo drumming. I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but he brought the drums. All of a sudden became more important than they had ever been before. Of course, a lot of people couldn't do what he did. Also, you had a lot of leaders wouldn't allow you to, which was basically the problem anyway. There's probably a lot of drummers who had the might have had the knowledge or the guts even, to do it, except they'd be fired, because that was the routine. The drums up to this point, including recording everything, was keep it cool, keep it quiet, keep time, and that was it. And Chick, now what he did is he brought solo drumming into the timekeeping patterns. He brought in more, not fills. He was actually playing very aggressive. He brought aggressiveness into the drumming, where instead of just laying back and being cool, which is another art, that's something a lot of drummers could learn to do. He brought the opposite, which is what everybody had to do then in those days, was keep it cool. Now all of a sudden he brought this aggressiveness in. He made the drums shine. But of course he had to be careful now of not getting in the way. I'll be honest, I heard times when he was in the way. It's not perfect, but it was experimental.
Yeah, it was brand new.
That's it. It was experimental and it was real. And it's the way he felt, and probably each time he played it, he probably heard a little more here, a little less there. He did this a little more the next time. I mean, these are just single performances.
That's right.
That we're lucky to even have on tape or wax or whatever.
Yeah.
So we don't even know about all the other wonderful nights there were of performance.
Oh, that's
that were not captured, but somebody heard them, and but this is what's happening now. And this is now the beginning of an era that starts what is continued later on with Gene Krupa. And Gene was lucky he had the opportunity to do it in Goodman's band, and that Benny even allowed him to do that.
Yeah.
And it might have even come out of the fact that, now I'm not positive, did they play opposite Chick's band?
Very early on.
Long before 38 Carnegie Hall.
Yes, it's a little known fact, but they did actually.
Now Benny was probably impressed by that whole thing, where and his way of how, after being blown out by the Chick Webb band, his whole thought is, how can we get even? And that means I got to let Gene play more aggressive. We got to do something like that. This is what knocked and that's the truth, because I could see why everybody was knocked out with the Chick Webb band at the Savoy Ballroom. Is that aggressive drumming?
Yeah.
Everybody likes loud drums for some reason or other, except musicians, of course, and depends on the music. But it knocked the people out, and it gave the band a drive that nobody else was doing, So naturally, Chick was really knocking everybody's bands, and that was always a double bandstand there, And
right.
Anybody that played opposite him, and he had the house band, was getting wiped out by him. It was actually him doing it, and so what was the secret was more aggressive drumming.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it depended on your book too, but the Fletcher Henderson book was made to order for that. Actually, it's just a matter of Gene being allowed to do it.
Yeah.
And I think Benny opened up on him and let him do it.
It's funny you mentioned that, because Gene joined Benny in a very early 35. And when they talk about the Goodman Band and the Chick Webb Band, they usually refer to the battle of the bands that they had later on, Harry James and when that band, 37, 38. But it's a little-known fact that in 1935, Goodman and Webb did a series of one-nighters with each other at the Savoy Ballroom, not in a battle, but just at that point, just alternating.
Yeah.
And that's probably when Chick made such a distinct impression on Gene, because the next drummer we're going to go to is Gene Krupa, and you'll hear a difference before.
The most influential of all timboleros for decades to come. Tito Puente, inspired by Gene Krupa's jazz drumming, transformed the role of the timbales by placing them at the front of the band. This placement does not work acoustically for the conjunto and charanga format with its smaller forces that, given the limited amplification of the time, needed to maintain a dynamic balance between the instruments, often through a semicircular layout with the percussion section placed at the back. Influenced by jazz styles of drumming, improvisation, Tito Puente changed the emphasis and to some extent the role of the timbales in Latin music. The fact that he was a dancer and able to perform on timbales while dancing in formation with other dancers introduced a new form of virtuosic showmanship. He certainly developed the timbales improvisational style with his in-depth understanding of both Cuban dance music and jazz.
And at the end it goes throughout and ends up the tune in 3-2. That's the whole thing about the adventure of a 2-3 clave. So, to end this first set, I have a special guest. He's a household name here at the House of Swing. This gentleman means so much to the music of jazz, his family, who he is. He is a modern drummer, and he also a historical drummer in my eyes. This gentleman did a show just recently on the music of Max Roach and did a tremendous job. His name is Ali Jackson. That's my partner in crime. You guys have seen us together with the orchestra, with Wynton. We're constantly fighting and loving each other up on this stage. So, but you know, the drum set. Just to give you a quick history, fun fact: the drum set has been played throughout the music, throughout the Mambo era, throughout the Palladium era. We have many drummers: Tony Escoli, Tito Puente himself, Ubaldo Nieto. These are people who also played the trap set, the drum set. It wasn't prominent all the time, but they did play it. And I learned a lot, you know, from Mr. Jose Madera and Joe Conso Sr. knowing all this stuff. I thought this was something that was done later, but it was apparent that during the 40s and 50s, these Latin bands were already using trap set, using the timbales as their toms, and they would use the hi-hat and the bass drum. So this is a wonderful way of introducing this. Please enjoy. 2/3 advance.
Tito Puente also appeared on Sesame Street and played with Styx too. Tito Puente actually started out on the Black American drum kit and then picked up the timbales later. No, seriously, I'm not making this up.
How do you hold it? I don't want to hold it, but you seem to hold it very lightly. It's almost.
Yes, I do.
What's the key to the way you hold the sticks? Say it again! Hold the sticks.
Well, the main thing is use your wrist more, not as it goes along. Well, I studied drums for many years, and then I went over to timbales. Say it again! I studied drums for many years, and then I went over to timbales, so I have more or less the American.
Who's the best drummer you ever heard?
Well, when I was very young, about 14, I went to a contest, and I did Sing, 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 Gene Krupa's Sing, 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 and I won first prize, and it was, I think, $10.
Tito Puente loved playing the Black American drum kit and wanted to be like Gene Krupa. Gene Krupa took after the Black American drumming greats Alfred Tubby Hall, Warren Baby Dodds, and Zeddy Singleton. Zeddy is shown rocking the cowbell, with block and cymbals, which were standard equipment with the Black American drum kit from its inception. At its inception, the timbale, which is derived from the Italian timpani or kettle drum, had no accompaniment, no cowbell, no wood block, and no cymbals. They are basically higher-pitched tom-tom drums. The Black American
with sticks, okay?
End of flashback.
Wait, it gets worse!
During the early 20th century, as Cuban musicians traveled to and from the US, the timbal became influenced by the drum set.
Say it again!
The timbal became influenced by the drum set and transitioned from being constructed of the materials found locally in sugarcane factories to the metal shells, stands, and hardware we see today.
This is the problem with these White Ricans. They are trying to speak down to Black Americans without realizing the relationship between Black Americans and Cuba is deeper and more nuanced than they could ever imagine. I touched upon this relationship in Hip Hop 202 La Habana. But for some reason, these White Ricans keep trying to co-opt Cuban culture and weaponize it against Black Americans. Perhaps Baba Del Jones said it best.
The importance of culture. It's everything you do, how you do it, how often and why. Everything we produce fall under the realm of culture. Therefore, either you're dabbling in somebody else's culture or you're creating your own.
Puerto Ricans are known.
I've always grown up with the jazz feeling because I was born in Harlem, in New York, and the Latin. And then
Puente's sense of biculturalism was not limited to being bilingual but also due to an identification with African American music and jazz. As he told Loza, "Well, I was very much into the black people. We used to call them colored people in those days, you know. I was involved with jazz. I went to black schools. They were right there in the neighborhood. I never had any conflict with them, and music-wise, they were my heroes. Some of them were my mentors, like Ellington and Basie at the time, and Lucky Millinder, and Chick Webb. All those bands. I was a young fellow, so I used to listen to a lot of the jazz music in those days, and all Latin music. We got that in the neighborhood because it wasn't as exposed as the jazz music was. So I'm very happy I got brought up with both cultures, and we really got along and developed all our music together through all these years."
Afro-Cubans began using strips of wood from cargo crates, which had to be glued together to make their drums. But I digress. Right before Jimmy Castor hits the timbales, he starts hitting the cowbell, which is attached to the timbales. Now a funny thing happened on the way to the timbale/drum break. For an explanation, let's listen to Tito Puente's idol break down what he does before his drum breaks.
You know, give the signal for the band to come on in, which in my case used to be, I haven't got a cowbell here, but I always... What the fuck? Say it again! Oh, I haven't got a cowbell here, but I always, when I was getting ready to go out, I never had in my own band, I never had a stipulated amount of bars to play. But when I'd be playing along, and when I gave this signal, that would mean that I'm going to go out pretty soon, and of course I'd make a pretty obvious break as to where they should come in, like...
So there you have it, family. Jimmy Castor's so-called Latin breakdown is just a common black American drum kit breakdown. In fact,
Solo break. A jazz term that instructs a lead player or rhythm section member to play an improvised solo cadenza for one or two measures, sometimes abbreviated as break, without any accompaniment. The solo part is often played in a rhythmically free manner, until the player performs pickup or lead in line, at which time the band recommences playing in the original tempo.
So clear. A solo means you speak, and hopefully everyone else will listen. Carlos Enrique. When the band stops and lets you have it alone, and then they come back in to make sure that you've kept the time, that's called a break. You get to have your say, and so does everyone else.
After saving with customized car insurance from Liberty.
Loza, did the charanga style of playing and orchestration penetrate Puente's concept? Santos. It had been in Havana, but it started to break here in New York in 55, 56. So the bands approached it still with that big band feel as opposed to the orchestras Aragon and America and their strings and flute. Good rhythm but not as heavy and loud, more relaxed, lighter type of rhythm section as compared to the big band rhythm sections that they needed here to propel those big saxophone and trumpet sections. But Aragon was the original concept. They didn't do the heavy breaks back then. That's Puente's thing. He likes breaks because naturally they give him a chance to do his thing with the band on timbales. He also approached the cha-cha differently. The New York style of cha-cha was different. The charangas didn't catch on here until the 60s. And about all music of African descent. That is, for us descargar meant to improvise in the sense that American jazz musicians say, to jam, or to blow. But descarga as a substitute for the term jam session was an invention of the creators of feeling, from whom Cuban jazz musicians, many of whom were closely associated with feeling, took the term.
In the 50s is when he became known as a band leader. And his popularity, of course, as a band leader grew. But his group was like an incubator for the great musicians in Havana at the time. The percussion in Cuban music had always been an accompanying instrument, meant to back up the singers, play rhythm for the dancers to dance to. It was not your job to sit there and take solos or to improvise or to play fancy. No, you play time. And that was your job. But those descargas of Cachao, he did it in a special way, and it was the pinnacle. At that time in 57, when that happened, it was the pinnacle of this idea of the percussionists as virtuosos. Those gentlemen I mentioned, Barretico, Tatawines, they were Picassos on their instruments. They didn't just hold time. They had great sense of time, great sound on their instruments.
The most influential of all timbaleros for decades to come. Tito Puente, inspired by Gene Krupa's jazz drumming, transformed the role of the timbales by placing them at the front of the band. This placement does not work acoustically for the conjunto and charanga format with its smaller forces that, given the limited amplification of the time, needed to maintain a dynamic balance between the instruments, often through a semicircular layout with the percussion section placed at the back. Influenced by jazz styles of drumming, improvisation, Tito Puente changed the emphasis and to some extent the role of the timbales in Latin music. The fact that he was a dancer and able to perform on timbales while dancing in formation with other dancers introduced a new form of virtuosic showmanship. He certainly developed the timbales improvisational style with his in-depth understanding of both Cuban dance music and jazz.
On their instruments. They didn't just hold time. They had great sense of time, great sound on their instruments.
But there was another Tito too. Tito Puente was born in El Barrio, just 3 years after his parents arrived from Puerto Rico. Always interested in music, as a teenager he turned away from that of his parents. For Puente, nothing beats swing. At 14, he saw drummer Gene Krupa at the Paramount Theater. I knew right there what I wanted, to be Gene Krupa, he later said. But Puente found immediate work in the local Latin bands and took up the timbales. He soon found himself under the wing of Mario Balsa.
He was one of my mentors, taught me a lot about playing, performing, rehearsing bands, because I worked with Machito for quite a few years. Then the war came around and I was drafted.
A bugler and gunner's mate in the Navy, Puente saw combat in World War II. He also played saxophone in bands to entertain the crews. By the end of the 1940s, Puente was running his own band and revolutionizing the role of the timbales.
starts making the instrument a vibrant force in the orchestra. Very much like Gene Krupa. Before Gene Krupa, drummers were not featured artists or anything like that. All of a sudden, Gene Krupa comes out and he's like a featured soloist. Tito does the same thing.
Puente was just getting started. His career as a consummate musician, bandleader, and arranger lasted over 50 years.
As Mario Bauzá said many, many times, nobody has done more for Afro-Cuban music than Tito Puente. Nobody.
How did Tito Puente use the timbales? Have you ever wondered how one man could change the way a musical instrument is perceived? Tito Puente did just that with the timbales. These shallow, high-pitched drums originated in Cuba as a lighter alternative to classical timpani. Traditionally, timbales were played with wooden sticks, focusing on rhythmic patterns that complemented Latin dance music styles like danzón, mambo, and cha-cha-cha. Tito Puente took the timbales and transformed them from a background instrument into a lead solo instrument in Latin music performances. He was not just a drummer, he was a musical innovator. By incorporating techniques from jazz and trap drumming, he expanded the expressive range of the timbales. This meant using a variety of stick strokes, rim shots, and rolls to create dynamic solos that showcase the timbales' versatility. Puente did not stop there. He integrated the timbales into the overall Latin rhythm section, emphasizing their melodic and percussive potential. He played not only the drumheads but also the metal shells, along with attached cowbells or cymbals. This creative use of auxiliary percussion sounds allowed him to maintain time while adding texture to the music. By moving the timbales to the front of the stage, Puente elevated their status in the music world. His energetic playing style ranged from delicate touches to heavy, commanding strikes. This allowed the timbales to compete with louder instruments, even those in rock music. Tito Puente's innovative approach made the timbales synonymous with Latin jazz and salsa music. He used them as a lead instrument by incorporating jazz techniques, expanding rhythmic patterns, and emphasizing solo performances. His creativity helped define the sound of Afro-Latin music and Latin jazz, making the timbales a symbol of Latin cultural musical identity. Through his work, Tito Puente showed the world that the timbales could be much more than just a rhythm instrument. They became a powerful voice in Latin music, thanks to his passion and talent.
Well, I grew up in Spanish Harlem, where there was a lot of Cubans, where I learned the Latin music with the Cubans and the jazz with the Americans. And of course, all the jazz artists used to live in Harlem also. I used to go around with my favorite bands were like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, then Woody Herman, Stan Kenton. And therefore, throughout the years, I was always involved with jazz and living in a Latin neighborhood. So I combined both music together. I grew up with that music.
Bebop music stressed improvisation with players stretching out in longer extended solos. Music of the swing era was mostly read and highly organized, but bebop used head tunes or arrangements that were memorized. Along with the rhythmic figures and new phrasing that gave the music its name, a new harmonic language was created that greatly affected the tonal colors and texture of the music. Around 1939, Dizzy, Monk, and later, Parker began using alterations and extensions to chords such as B-fifth, B-ninth, and #9th to dominant chords and 7th, 9th, and #11th to major chords. They also used chord substitutions. The harmony became very complex, making great theoretical demands on musicians who attempted to play the music. In bebop music, the soloist became a virtuoso, showing off his improvisational skills with furiously fast lines and acrobatic figures. This was very much unlike the swing bands, where the band was in the spotlight with little attention paid to the limited space for the soloists. The great demands made on musicians, which humbled quite a few of them, were learned in informal jam sessions in which soloists could learn the tunes and embroider them with skillful improvisations. One of the impacts of bebop on jazz was that it elevated jazz theory in phrasing, harmony, and rhythm, in no uncertain terms.
In 1940, Teddy Hill bought a small jazz club called Minton's Playhouse from Henry Minton. Neither knew at the time the club was soon to be a key part of jazz history. Every Monday, after commercial performances at the Apollo Theater, jazz musicians would gather at Minton's for informal jam sessions. Minton's Playhouse was critical to the development of bebop. Musicians could experiment with improvisation there, but not without experiencing criticality of their peers and audiences. Minton's did in a lot of musicians as a result, who just disappeared, but it also taught a whole lot of musicians and made them what they eventually became, including Thelonious Monk, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Christian, Kenny Clark, and Charlie Parker.
And if there's two things that musicians like are jam sessions and a great house band, and so Teddy brought those two things together at Minton's. And so he created the terms, he created the atmosphere, he created the environment for what needed to happen to make Minton's a great club for jazz musicians to want to come after hours and play.
Hay danzones hoy en día que son hasta de música de jazz, convertida en danzón, melodías jazzísticas convertidas en danzón. Y hay improvisaciones donde ha permitido que esta música se siga desenvolviendo hasta los días de hoy.
Mambo was so popular here in New York, and then jazz players from the United States, Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Zoot Sims, Dexter Gordon, all great soloists of the 1950s. We could call that the bebop era, the era of bebop, where the jazz took on a completely different direction, more harmonic and rhythmic and melodic variations from the standard jazz of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. But in the 50s is where we started to get this combination of jazz and Afro-Cuban. And one of the first terms that they used was, since it was Cuban and it was bebop, then we have the term Q-bop. Q-bop. And that term was used for quite a while. Then they just went into another term called mambo jazz. And that was used for, but in the last 20 or 25 years, the term that is used now, it seems to be the standard term, is Latin jazz.
Cachao played in a number of Cuban musical revues and theater orchestras throughout the 1940s and 1950s. Playing the new mambos and cha-cha-chas, he performed with the Jose Fajardo Orchestra, Fajardo y sus Estrellas, with Jesus Lopez, Ulpiano Diaz, Felix Reina, and Gustavo Tamayo, and with Kinguero Tata Guines. In the 1950s, Cachao and a group of musicians began to get together for informal jam sessions, out of which emerged the famous descargas that integrated jazz improvisations into Cuban music.
In the 50s is when he became known as a band leader. And his popularity, of course, as a band leader grew. But his group was like an incubator for the great musicians in Havana at the time. The percussion in Cuban music had always been an accompanying instrument, meant to back up the singers, play rhythm for the dancers to dance to. It was not your job to sit there and take solos or to improvise or to play fancy. No, you play time, and that was your job. But those descargas of Cachao, he did it in a special way. And it was the pinnacle. At that time in '57, when that happened, it was the pinnacle of this idea of the percussionists as virtuosos. Those gentlemen I mentioned, Barretico, Tatawines, they were Picassos on their instruments. They didn't just hold time. They had great sense of time, great sound on their instruments.
By 1957, he was creating yet a new sound, with his fabled recordings of the Cuban jam sessions, or descargas. Never before had anyone gathered Havana's top musicians in a recording studio for a freewheeling improv session. The musical results were revolutionary, merging Cuban musical idioms with the improvisatory techniques and rhythmic swing of African-American jazz.
And Cachao, with his improvisations, with his descarga, brought that unique element of improvisation to music. And improvisation is really, comes from the soul. You can be a great technical musician, but a lot of people can't improvise because you're writing on the spot. And I think listening to him do this and seeing the many ways that he would take a theme and then go crazy with it on the bass, give the trumpet, give the piano a space.
Sort of free association jam sessions, incorporating elements of American jazz and Afro-Cuban rhythms, like fusing that and creating these sort of jam sessions or descargas where musicians were able to really, be highlighted,
I think he...
Let loose, let rip. In the late 50s, a new concept of improvised Cuban jazz emerged in after-hours sessions in Havana. Some of the greatest innovators of the decade, who normally played the tourist clubs, flocked to late-night sessions where improvisation and free-form structures were tested. The inventive pianist Bebo Valdez, who was directing the Tropicana Orchis TRA in 1952, rustled together some of his band at an after-hours bar, and produced 5 singles, including a free-form jam called Con Poco Poco. A couple of years later, the double bass player and co-inventor of the mambo, Israel Cachao Lopez, organized his own after-hours sessions and called them Descargas, Letting Loose, Letting Rip. These were immortalized in a 5-volume set of Cuban jam sessions for Panart Records recorded in 1955 and 1957.
Y Santa Isabel, en casa de mi tío, de José Isabel Barreto. Él viene a pasar todo el tiempo que hiciera falta en casa de mi tío. Allí había un piano, allí él realizaba sus estudios de música. Con mi tío José Isabel quería meter en cintura a los jóvenes del barrio, quería que se educaran, quería que vieran teatro, quería hacerlos partícipes de todas esas ideas que bullían en él. Y él se acordaba de una serie de contradanzas anónimas que había oído y se acordaba de los bailes. Y se dio a la tarea de reunir una serie de jóvenes, muchachas y muchachos, para montarle esas piezas de cuadro. Esto lo digo porque esto no ha salido en ningún lugar, no está en ningún lugar, no se conoce. Y él le da la tarea a Bebo de llevar esas piezas de cuadro, que él se las iba a cantar, que él se las iba a tocar en la guitarra, que tocaba un poquito de guitarra, para que Bebo las llevara al papel. Como él ya estaba progresando en la música, algunas veces le quería hacer un arreglo especial a esas contradanzas, y mi padrino le decía, no me cambies la música que yo te estoy dando, no me improvises, ni me toques nada americano. Yo no quiero acordes americanos. Yo me recuerdo que mi padrino hablaba de los acordes americanos. Él no sabía ni lo que estaba diciendo, me decía, no me pongas, Bebo, acordes americanos. Tócamelas como yo te las estoy dando. Pero qué va, de vez en cuando Bebo tocaba su acorde y eso.
Y en el 37 hicimos una orquesta de jazz, lo que nos gustaba ya en el conservatorio. Hicimos una orquesta de jazz los alumnos. Entonces en el 38 empecé en la Happy Dulace, la primera orquesta profesional que toqué. Que eran temporadas que se ganaban.
Los que fueron testigos. Sin embargo, el destino le sonrió a Bebo, cuando un día se apareció en Tropicana el célebre productor de jazz Norman Granz, y le encargó a Bebo la primera grabación de la historia de una descarga cubana, Con Poco Coco.
Con Poco Coco es un tumbado, nada más que eso. Fue una cosa que yo estaba haciendo. Cuando a Mando le faltaban 4 o 5 minutos, toca algo, boom, cubano, boom, ya tumbaba, ponía a tocar cualquier cosa, todo lo tumbado, eso es lo que yo tengo. Con Carlito, Barretico, y el descargado, porque quien anda en el bajo, se metía Gustavo Más, el negro, Escalante, bueno, hacíamos eso. Y fueron 2 o 3 americanos que hablaron conmigo, de que ese número que tú estás tocando, qué cosa es. Él dice que bueno. Bueno, si tú lo quieres grabar, digo, ¿por qué no? Hicimos 4 o 5 descargas, nada escrito, todo hablado ahí, improvisado todo. Y eso fue que después nos mangaron, porque si hubiera sido otro no nos hubiera grabado. Porque tiraba mucho para allá, no hace nada más que improvisación, no tiene melodía. Eso fue lo que le gustó a él.